everybody, my name's Dana and I'm the physical therapist at the Smith Balance and Concussion Center, and I wanted to talk to all of you today about some of the different things we hear in the clinic when it comes to concussion. And I really am doing this in order to educate everybody so that we can all get on the same page when it comes down to concussion management. The science on this is coming out so fast that anywhere from other therapists to trainers to parents and coaches, even physicians, it's hard to keep up with the best practices and the latest research on concussion management. So I want to get us all changing the conversation we're having regarding concussions, which are mild traumatic brain injuries, and start getting on the same page so that we make sure that we're handling concussions the best way possible. So one of the things that I hear in the clinic all the time is, well, shouldn't I get an MRI? Or I was at the emergency room and they did a CAT scan and my CAT scan came back normal, so I don't have a concussion, right? Well, the answer to that is you still might have a concussion, unfortunately. So these tests, an MRI and a CAT scan, are wonderful because they scan for a bigger injury, such as a brain bleed. That is really important to rule out, especially if you have a more severe injury with loss of consciousness and things like that at the onset. So having those tests are important if we need to rule out a more severe injury. However, a concussion happens at a cellular level, and the injury itself is microscopic in nature. So unfortunately, as of right now, there are no diagnostic tests that are available which will show a concussion. There are things in the works. Hopefully the technology eventually will be there, but as of right now, a CAT scan or an MRI will not show a concussion. Something else that we hear in the clinic a lot is, well, I was wearing a helmet, so I couldn't have gotten a concussion. Boy, do I wish this was true, right? If this was true, no one in hockey, no one in the NFL would ever get a concussion, right? Because they're all wearing protective headgear. So helmets, mouth guards, things like that are great at, again, preventing injuries such as fractures, things like that, getting your teeth knocked out. Those are all important things. But your brain kind of floats inside of your skull. And so no matter what happens with your helmet, whether you have one on or you have one off, if you get hit with a bump or a blow to the body or to the head, your brain is still able to move inside of the skull. And it's that rapid movement where it can move forwards or backwards or even twist around inside the skull that causes the injury to the brain at the cellular level that we discussed a little bit earlier. So a helmet is great, protective gear is great and necessary, but they will not stop a concussion from happening because there's nothing that we can do to anchor the brain in place inside of the skull. That would be the only way one of those devices would be beneficial at prevention of concussion. Something else that we hear a lot is, well, I just stayed in the game, or I knew something wasn't right after I crashed into that other player, but I kept playing for a few hours, and then by the time I got home, I felt miserable. I was nauseous, I threw up, I had a headache, I was dizzy, I couldn't think straight. So we hear those kinds of things all the time. And the CDC and the Heads Up program has a really fantastic phrase called, when in doubt, sit it out. And this is a hard one to get across. I know you guys are dedicated athletes, dedicated employees, things like that. But it's better to miss a game or one practice and play it safe and make sure that you're okay than continue playing when you do or might have a concussion. Because should you sustain a second injury right after that first one or within the time frame of healing from when a concussion occurs, you could risk having a more severe injury. And that is called second impact syndrome. And second impact syndrome really comes with a lot of swelling and problems in the brain that could eventually lead to even death if it gets out of control. So playing with a concussion is something that we don't want to do, and so it's better to be a little bit cautious if you sustain any kind of injury that would produce a concussion, to kind of take it easy, sit out the rest of that game, sit out the rest of that practice, and make sure that you're okay before you return to playing perhaps the next day if everything is all right. Your brain is too important, so let's do what we can to keep it protected. Another thing that we hear all of the time is, well, my friends told me that concussion symptoms can't last this long, so that's not from that. Or, well, my injury was 4 months ago and I'm still getting headaches, but that can't be from a concussion, can it? Yes, it can. It absolutely can be. So most concussions, we'll go into the healing of concussions a little bit. Most concussion symptoms will go away within the first 7 to 10 days. And they go away on their own with proper management from the beginning. And then the brain continues to heal for anywhere from 22 to 30 days on average. And then you're okay. You're recovered from that concussion. Sometimes though, over 30% of the time, and the number might be more than that because people are very reluctant to report these symptoms, but we do know that at least 30% of people with concussion develop post-concussion syndrome. And this is when concussion symptoms are prolonged and last more than 30 days. Now, on average, we want to see someone in the clinic here by day 7, especially if they're still symptomatic. But officially to be diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome, it comes at the 30-day mark. And post-concussion syndrome happens when concussions are not managed properly from the very beginning. So for example, it was very common to wake somebody up every hour after we thought that they had a concussion. It was also very common perhaps to stay in a dark room with no music, no television, keep the lights off and keep it nice and quiet for weeks or until your symptoms go away. We now know that that isn't the best way to manage these head injuries, that after a day or two, you really should be supervised in progressing back into activity as tolerated. So if the concussion isn't managed from the beginning, it actually prolongs healing of the brain and delays recovery. So it's not uncommon for me to see someone here who had their head injury perhaps a year or more ago, and they're still symptomatic. So this is why it's really important to get on a concussion immediately and start managing it properly from the beginning so that we can ensure and help reduce the risk of that person developing post-concussion syndrome. And I actually just heard this one the other day, was that, well, my doctor said I didn't have a loss of consciousness, so my concussion wasn't a big deal. So yes, loss of consciousness is one of those things that if it does happen with a concussion, it's really, really strongly advised that you go to the emergency room immediately. If someone loses consciousness along with any kind of head injury, those are one of those situations where we would want to make sure that there wasn't something more significant going on, like a brain bleed. So a loss of consciousness does mean that perhaps your concussion is more significant, not necessarily though. However, only 10% of concussions have a loss of consciousness. So this means 90% of people that get concussions do not lose consciousness, which means concussions, no matter what, whether you have a loss of consciousness or not, they're all a big deal and they all need to be managed the right way. Again, so that we don't prolong recovery and go into that post-concussion syndrome. So, another thing that we've noticed is that people tell us, sorry, I'm looking down at my notes to see what people are telling us, is I didn't want to tell my coach about it. I don't know how many concussions I've had, I've stopped counting. And I've had more than this current concussion, but I never told anybody about them. I think that this is our responsibility as parents and healthcare providers and coaches and trainers and everyone in the medical community that deals with people with concussion. We have to create an environment in which it's okay to discuss these types of injuries. Okay, we do this with other injuries, right? We acknowledge if someone has a broken bone, we acknowledge if someone has a sprained ankle, and we follow a course of recovery for those types of injuries, or if someone had surgery, we follow those protocols to get them back to being able to do their sport. And I think that the fear is that if someone gets a concussion, they're not going to be allowed to play ever again, or that we don't want kids or athletes to participate in their sport, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. The goal with concussion management is to get back to the sport as quickly and safely as possible, just as we would with any other injury. So let's all work together to change the environment so that we all feel comfortable discussing concussion, just like we would any other injury that could occur in sports. We talked about this a little bit before, but we're going to touch upon concussion management a little bit. So someone said to me that they felt fine and within a few days after their injury, and then they went back to playing their sport. A lot of people say, oh, I didn't even know that anything could be done to help me. Some people are still saying, well, my doctor told me to stay in a dark, quiet room until my symptoms went away, and then I was able to get back to my regular life. And like we discussed before, we know that staying in a dark, quiet room until your symptoms go away is really the worst thing that we can do now. So we want to give the brain a little bit of time after the injury. So anywhere from 48 to 72 hours at the most. That might be pushing it a little bit, but 72 hours at the most, where we give it some cognitive rest. We decrease screen time, we decrease anything that really kind of jacks up and irritates those symptoms and makes them worse. And then after that period of time, we need to work on slowly increasing activity so that we can facilitate healing of the brain. And this goes along with maybe making modifications at home or at school or at work, and then once they're tolerating that a little bit better, finding ways to get back into those recreational and athletic activities. Another thing that I want to just touch on is someone said recently, don't you think we're overdoing it with this concussion stuff? I don't think so. I don't think that we can be overdoing it when it comes to our brain. So yes, I know it's inconvenient if we have to pull a player or miss a day of work because maybe we fell in the parking lot before we got in and think that we might have a concussion, or we collide with another player and think that we might have a concussion. Yes, it's an inconvenience, I understand that, but again, let's work together and change the concussion conversation, change the culture around concussion management so that it's okay to discuss these things, because really, we can't be too careful with our brains. As always, if you have any questions about concussions or concussion management or how we can help you manage your concussion, please don't ever hesitate to give me a call. Thanks so much, everybody.